This could be the most deceptive and quite possibly unlawful strategies I've ever seen from TV licensing. And by the end of the video, I think you'll be thanking me for the discount that I get you with my partner to this video, which is Incogni, for reasons I'll explain throughout this video. So I was contacted by one of my viewers who's had a bit of a dispute with TV licensing, which is a trademark of the BBC contracting out most of the services to enforce TV licensing. And my viewer submitted a subject access request. This letter is not a response to the subject access request. This letter, I understand, is a response to the complaint following the letters received. So before I go through this letter, if you do like me to give you these objective, neutral, but brutal breakdowns of these kind of letters and stories and politics and the law and the news as it is, please do consider liking the video, subscribe to my channel, and ring that notification bell so you don't miss out on future videos. That really helps my channel grow. So let's get into this letter and let's have a look at where it all started, which is the bit in the big red box. Now, it started because my viewer received a letter, as many people have done, from TV licensing. And my viewer wrote as follows. I've received one of your new threatening letters claiming that I've been watching iPlayer over recent weeks, when I haven't. I have all BBC accounts blocked on social media, and I watch media on Disney+, YouTube, Amazon Prime, and consume zero BBC content. Now, I have to pause for a moment just to clarify that a TV license is not dependent upon BBC content alone. I have to say that if you watch or record any live TV or consume BBC content through BBC iPlayer, you need a TV license. So it is not a prerequisite to be watching BBC content to require a TV license. That said, it makes no material difference to this particular letter. But I had to make that clear. So back to this. So consumes zero BBC content, which is not material to the case, but that's not the point. He goes on. I want to know, how was this mistake made, and would like a sincere apology for the needless stress and anxiety you are causing me. Now, clearly, BBC via TV licensing have written to my viewer insisting that he buy a license, should he need one, on the basis that he's been watching BBC iPlayer. Now, how on earth would they know that, you might ask? Well, it could be relatively straightforward. If you have an account with BBC iPlayer, it's linked to your address, then you are not so inadvertently telling BBC that you are using BBC content, because they will track anything that you watch whilst you're logged in. That, so much, is fairly straightforward. However, there's reasons that is far more complicated in this case, which I'll come back to in just a moment. But this letter, in response to the complaint, opened as follows. You contacted us on the 31st of August after receiving a letter from TV licensing about the apparent use of BBC iPlayer at the above address. We are sorry that you felt the need to contact us about the letter for any concern it may have caused you. The reasons for the letter require some explanation. Now, anything that requires a bit of an explanation means that it wasn't entirely straightforward the first time round, but by the by. They say that we apologise that it's taken longer than we would have wished to respond to you. The BBC is responsible for issuing TV licenses and enforcing the requirements to have one, including the BBC iPlayer. This is why BBC, not TV licensing, is replying to you. The day-to-day running is contracted out under the brand of TV licensing, which is a trademark used by the BBC and its contractors when doing its work. So that's the set out of the letter. Now, the reason for the letter, and this is why, in a moment, I will introduce my partner to you, because you will see the very value of my partner for this video when you understand what's going on and what's blown this story up in the first place. Reason for the letter. So this is the BBC's reason for sending out the letter in the first place. The BBC says as follows. Your postal address is listed as one where we've been told that no TV license is needed. Many people do that. They tell them they don't need a license, and many people don't have a problem with it. He goes on. One way TV licensing checks that households are properly licensed is to compare its records of no license needed postal addresses with email addresses that have been used to access BBC iPlayer through a BBC account. Nothing untoward so far. If you have a BBC account with your email address linked to it, and it's linked to your address, and you log in, fair enough, you might think. It gets worse. For a number of years, we've made these checks using TV licensing records and BBC iPlayer records, which is what I just mentioned. But, and here's where it gets quite outrageous, I have to say. I was quite blown away by all of this coming forward. But recently, we have used data provided by a third party to increase effectiveness of this approach. Sega City Solutions provided TV licensing with further email addresses linked to no license needed postal addresses. So let's just take that aside for a second. So Sega City Solutions has provided BBC with a whole database, I presume, of email addresses that are linked to physical addresses. We'll come back to the use of that data in just a moment. But they've provided all this information to the BBC. The BBC has compared that with the list that it keeps of no license needed at that address. And then it goes on, and letters were sent to those addresses if the BBC could see that the email address had been used to access BBC iPlayer. Now, straight away, there's a disconnect there. They are sending letters to an address because the email address has been used to access BBC iPlayer. Now, aside from people moving house, whether that's selling up and moving on, or moving out of a rented accommodation and moving on, or growing up and moving out of your parents' home, or whatever it might be, you will, I presume, still use the same email address if you do use BBC iPlayer, but then you've moved on. You're not at that address anymore, but the BBC nonetheless decided to send letters to those addresses because that email address had been used to access BBC iPlayer. Now, here's the real key. This is the bit that pushed me over the edge and decided to do this video. I don't do a video on every single letter and request that I receive. I receive thousands of them, as you can well imagine, but this bit takes the biscuit. This approach, the BBC said, has led to people deciding that they need to buy a TV license. Now, that can be viewed in two ways. I'm the advocate. I will give it you in both ways. Either the person receiving the letter has thought, yeah, I do need a TV license. You're correct. I didn't realize that. I will buy one. Or they've received the letter and thought, you got me. You've caught me out. Okay, I'll buy one. Or the alternative scenario is they've received this letter and thought, well, hang on a minute. They must be able to prove that I'm guilty of this offence, even though I don't actually watch any live TV content or record it. But I'll buy a license because I don't want to be prosecuted. That's the problem here. On the one hand, it's a perfectly legitimate prompt to buy a license where it is needed. They either didn't realise, or they didn't realise that it'd run out, or they were trying to avoid it, or whatever the reason might be. The one scenario is they genuinely do need the license. And so the BBC says this approach, i.e. using the data, I'll come back to that in just a moment, this approach has led people to decide that they buy a license. On the one hand, that's perfectly legitimate. On the other hand, some people may have purchased a license out of fear of prosecution, because a lot of people may well fear prosecution. People have told me on this channel numerous times that they've paid for a license, or they keep paying for a license because they don't want to be prosecuted, because it is still a criminal offence to be in breach of the Communications Act and watch or record live TV, or consume content from the BBC on BBC iPlayer, or install any apparatus for the purpose of any of those above without a TV license. That is still an offence. Now, if there was any doubt that that was possibly wrong, the BBC clarifies it here in the blue bit. But we also recognise that the email address provided by Sega City could belong to someone no longer associated with the address. Now, if I skip further down in this letter, it will become clear to you. I'll come back to this middle section in just a moment, but if I skip down to the latter part of this letter, it will become clear to you as to why my partner for this video is going to be so useful to you. Because Sega City is one of many companies that hold information on you, including your email address and your postal address. And in the case of Sega City, they've provided this to the BBC. The BBC have then cross-referenced it with no license needed addresses, and they're sending out letters threatening you to buy a TV license. Now, the reason this is a problem is Sega City is one of many third-party companies that hold data and information on you, and they sell or just provide access to it, as is confirmed by the BBC's own letter here. They say Sega City has contracts with third parties. Further third parties, third party to Sega City. So Sega City is a third party to the BBC, but Sega City has contracts with yet further third parties under which Sega City receives personal data about those third party customers, e.g. companies they've made purchases from. So you've made purchases from a company, they've retained your data, it says underneath, can we use your data to share it with our trusted third parties and partners and such like? And you either check, uncheck, don't check, and don't uncheck, check, uncheck the box. And sometimes you get that wrong because, they can't rely on a pre-checked box for certain things. But if it's worded the other way around, you get the picture. It could be all confusing. But one way or another, if they've gathered your information and then they've shared it on to another party that's shared it on to Sega City, who's then shared it on to the BBC then has a record of your email address, your postal address, and they're linking it up and they're sending you a letter. How do you stop all this? That's where my partner for this video comes in. Because many of these data broker marketing companies retain your data and they sell it on in precisely this way. This is why I take certain very select few partners for my channel here, who I believe provide you a valuable service to protect your privacy, your identity, and your security, protect you from scams and spam and all sorts of stuff. And in this case, hopefully limit and mitigate and maybe even eliminate the risk of these third-party companies gathering and sharing and selling your data to other companies such as Sega City that then provide it to the BBC that then come after you and threaten you with prosecution. Incogni is a fantastic service. You sign up, it's done for you, you create an account, they provide you a dashboard. Incogni contacts lots and lots, hundreds of these data broker marketing companies that gather your information together from all sorts of different sources, just like the BBC confirmed here in their own words. They confirmed just here, Sega City has contracts with third parties under which they receive personal data about you, their customers, to Sega City, and Sega City in turn have provided to the BBC. Incogni will require those companies to remove your data from their servers in accordance with GDPR. Now, of course, as a partner to my channel, you'll get a fantastic 60% discount using the code BlackBelt in the description below, and you can see it on screen. It's incogni.com/blackbelt. The links are in the description below. Grab yourself a discount. There's a 30-day money-back guarantee, and they will help to remove your data from companies like this. But coming back to this letter, I will also tell you why I think this is potentially unlawful, because that's what I said at the outset. It wasn't clickbait and it wasn't overly dramatic. I genuinely think there's a problem here. Now, coming back to what's going on here, the BBC said, we have verified that the email address, whatever it is, supplied by Sega City Solutions is associated with your postal address and an existing BBC iPlayer account that was set up in 2017. That email address is not the one you've used in your recent correspondence, but is used by someone else associated with your address, for instance, a family member or a previous occupant. The data for the letter you received used this email address and the associated data from the BBC iPlayer account. So it appears, at least so much as what my viewers told me, and the BBC seems to accept, that this email address and the associated data, the iPlayer data, is quite possibly someone else's. It's not my viewer's data. But the letter sent to my viewer used this data, i.e. this email address and the associated data from the BBC iPlayer account. The iPlayer data was selected on the 6th of August and showed that there were 5 iPlayer views over 2 days in the preceding 8 weeks. The most recent view, blah, blah, blah. Now, granted, it doesn't seem to have disclosed that email address, and it doesn't really disclose anything else about that unknown third party, but it's irrelevant because that could be someone else, somewhere else, and just hasn't updated the address, and it's just outdated and wrong. However, that person then has had their data used and processed in a certain way, and my viewer here has had their address, their data, their information used in a certain way. Now, on the assumption here, now I'm not making findings of fact, of course, and this is not legal advice, you all understand that by now, but on the assumption that this was all a big mistake, then both sets of data have been used wrongly and potentially unfairly. And the BBC here said, if you do recognize this address, let us know. If you don't recognize this address, this may be because the information held by Sega City Solutions relates to a previous occupant, or they've matched this information to your address in error. Now, the reason that's all a bit of a problem for the BBC is they have to comply with GDPR. And one of the main principles of GDPR is the processing of personal data is that it must be processed lawfully, fairly, in a transparent manner in relation to the data subject, which is a lawful fairness and transparency principle. Furthermore, let me zoom in so you can see it a little bit better. Furthermore, it should be collected for specified, explicit, and legitimate purposes and not further processed in a manner that is incompatible with those purposes. So let's walk this through. Person A goes into a shop and buys something, and they maybe even take out an insurance policy or whatever it might be, a warranty. They give their name and address and everything else and their email address for the purposes of the warranty for buying the product at that shop. That shop then asks them, can we use your data to share with our trusted third parties? And the person says, yeah, whatever. Then the processing, i.e. retaining it and sharing it and everything else, must be lawful, it must be fair, must be transparent, and in accordance with this principle, must not be further processed in a manner that is incompatible with those purposes. So if those purposes that are fairly and rightly understood by the individual to be to share with other companies for marketing purposes or sharing useful products or something that they actually should want. So, for example, I've just recently bought a new drone from DJI. Not sponsored by DJI, I might say. But if I say to DJI, yeah, sure, use my details for something that you think I might be interested in, and then suddenly I get an email from some other drone company or whatever, that's not absolutely out of the question, because I've said to DJI, yes, use my data to contact me for those reasons, and then I might get a contact from someone else offering me something that I might genuinely want. Likewise, if I did it with Sony, I use Sony for my cameras because I think they're absolutely fantastic. If I said to them, yes, sure, you can pass my details on, and they pass it on to someone else to provide something else, you get the picture. But the problem with that is this. If that information is then passed to Sega City and is then passed to the BBC, which is then used to threaten you with prosecution if you don't buy a TV license, I believe that then along that chain, your data is being further processed in a manner that is incompatible with those purposes that it was originally gathered for in the first place. And so I won't go through this in great detail, but suffice to say, I think there is a serious problem here via the GDPR and the way in which that data has been processed. Either, and this is where the fault lies, either with the original company that collected the data in the first place, and how they passed it on to someone else and maybe someone else, and maybe how they passed it on to Sega City, and then how Sega City passed it on to the BBC. Obviously, I don't know for a fact, because I don't know the chain of events and the chain of custody of that data, but there should be, because one of the other principles, it should be kept securely. One of the principles here under F, it should be processed in a manner that ensures appropriate security of the personal data, including protection against unauthorized or unlawful processing and against accidental loss, destruction, damage, etc., etc. So there's a number of question marks here of how that data, that email address, the postal address, and everything else has been used and passed from pillar to post, company to company, and ended up in the hands of the BBC. And they've then threatened my viewer with the need for a TV license. Now, this is not specific advice to that viewer, whether they need a license or not. Generally, if you watch or record live TV content from anywhere in the world on any device, or you consume BBC content on BBC iPlayer, or you install any apparatus for any of those purposes, then you need a TV license. And it's offence to do any of those things without a TV license. That in itself is a non-recordable offence with £1,000, I think up to £1,000 fine. And if you don't pay the fine, then that itself is a separate offence for which you could be imprisoned, but you cannot be imprisoned for not paying the TV license. The typical fine, I think, is £200 or £300. As I said, it's non-recordable, which means it disappears off any deep checks after 12 months, and it doesn't show up on a standard DBS check anyway. But that is broad guidance, not legal advice. But like I say, I don't approve of this strategy. It may be one of the strategies they've sort of cooked up to try to come up with a way of targeting individuals. Now, I understand they have a statutory duty and obligation to target those that are unlawfully watching TV without a license, but I just don't really agree with this way of doing it. I think there's a lot of problems along the way. I think someone could be in serious trouble there, not just with GDPR, but it could well amount to reckless communication, because in their own admission, BBC has confirmed here that this could have been matched in error, and they recognize that the email address could belong to someone no longer associated with the address. But this approach, they say, has led to people deciding that they need to buy a license. Now, as I said, they might decide to buy a license because they do need one, or they've been caught out evading the law, which I don't support, obviously. I mean, I might not agree with the law, that's different, but I can't support evading the law. That's not to say I agree with every law there is. I don't, as it happens, agree with every law that there is, but I can't encourage you to avoid the law because there are penalties for evading the law. But the alternative here is that some people have bought the license because they've received this letter that might just say, particularly if it's like this and it doesn't actually disclose the email address, d something 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 3 at gmail.com. If it doesn't disclose the address fully, they may be pushed into buying a license when they don't actually need one. Now, working that out logically, I presume they might say, yeah, that looks like my email address. Maybe that is me or whatever. I don't know. That's not the point. I think some people may well buy a license just under the threat of prosecution because the BBC say they've got this information. I understand there's a duty and a job to do. I just don't agree with the way in which they've done it. So if you want to try to mitigate and avoid all of that, check out Incogni. They will contact all of these data broker marketing companies that sell on your data, because ordinarily companies shouldn't be selling it on. They might pass it to third parties, but ultimately it may end up in the hands of brokers that are selling it, and they are literally selling you out. So check out Incogni, incogni.com/blackbelt for a 60% discount off an annual plan. Links are in the description below. I hope you found that useful, if not slightly horrifying. Please do hit the like button and subscribe, ring the notification bell, and as always, thank you for watching.